And I am pleased to welcome to the table Ruth Hardy, a senator from Vermont. Middlebury, in fact, has been in the House or the Senate there for about 5 years, your third term. So you know your way around now.
I do. I know where the ladies' room is.
Know all the answers. What do you hope to get out of this legislative summit? The 48th summit is bringing in 6,000 lawmakers and staff members,
Yeah.
The largest gathering of state legislative brain power. What do you take away from that?
Well, it's really great to be here in Indianapolis. It's a lovely city. I've never been before, so it's nice to come to a new place. And I came to be on two different panels. Back in Vermont, I chair the Senate Government Operations Committee, so we oversee, as the name implies, all the ways that the government operates, including elections policy. So I was on...
Which gets a little attention now and again.
It does. It's kind of a hot button issue right
Yeah.
now, elections policy. And yesterday I had the pleasure of being on a podcast that was live recording of a podcast here called Wide Margins, High Turnout. And it was great fun, along with a rep from Arkansas, and we talked about elections policy in our state. And I was also on a panel about legislative compensation, which is another issue that's a difficult thing to talk about in a lot of scenarios. State legislators in particular, are not compensated very well, and we have pretty tough jobs. So that's been an issue around the country, frankly. So it was really great to be on a panel talking about that.
It has been an ongoing issue in many, many states because of the reluctance to seemingly, quote unquote, grant oneself a pay increase, even though they're woefully small salaries in many states.
Yeah.
With a job that, whether it's a part-time legislature or a full-time legislature, tends to be a full-time job. I don't need to, constituents contact you not only during formal session day,
Absolutely.
days, I suppose. So you mentioned several things about elections, certainly legislative compensation. Are those, would you say, your legislative priorities, not only for what you hope to glean from this event, but back home? Is that are you known for those subjects?
Well,
You party girl, you elections and legislative compensation.
Exactly, that's so fun. Well, what I'm known for this past session, we worked hard in Vermont and passed a historic legislation for childcare, actually, that provides a historic investment in childcare and also expansion of our childcare system and support for our childcare providers, support for families, and support for children themselves. So that's the legislation that I'm most proud of from our past session. I think going into next session, we're not in session again until January, but going into the next session, I think our priorities will certainly be flood recovery. As you probably heard, we had catastrophic flooding in Vermont this summer, including in my district. And we're really just at the beginning stages of recovery. So I think we'll be talking a lot about flood recovery, flood resilience, and climate legislation, as we're seeing more and more climate-induced natural disasters around the country.
There's a lot of natural disasters. Certainly they have an immediate impact. It's very visible when somebody loses a business or a home or some sort of, but then there's that lagging effect of terms crop damage, or and you probably as a state, maybe you're still trying to assess just how far-reaching the impact might be.
Yeah, we're absolutely still in the assessment stage. People are still reporting damage. We had a lot of agricultural damage, both from the flooding and a freeze earlier this spring. So our crop farmers in particular, dairy farmers and orchards and vegetable farmers are all really, really hurting. So it's going to take a long time to recover and to really recoup the losses and figure out a way forward for the state, and also how we rebuild and do it in a way that will prevent future flooding. We were the victim of Hurricane Irene 11 years ago, which had similar impact on the state, and now here we're back with flooding. So we really need to get back to the conversation about resilient recovery and how we can do that. So I think that's going to be a huge issue next session.
You mentioned, before we move on to some other topics, the child care. It's interesting,
Yeah.
and you talked about the pride you had in what had been enacted in your state. We've heard warnings in just the recent weeks about a looming crisis because a lot of the federal dollars that had been set aside for child care that states have been using and other layers of government to help shore up child care. And there's a lot of fear about what you enacted in your state. Is this a bulwark against that kind of impact with the disappearance or the lessening of COVID? We'll call them COVID dollars.
Yeah, so during COVID, we were able to put a lot of money into childcare. And coming off of COVID, we knew that we had to continue those investments so that the sector didn't collapse, basically. So the bill that we just passed will invest over $125 million, which is a lot for our small state of Vermont, into childcare and provide childcare financial assistance to families up to over 400% of federal poverty levels, so that even middle class, working class, and lower income families will all qualify for assistance and be able to afford child care, and therefore be able to afford to have work-life balance, be able to afford to have a job that they can support their family with. So there are economic impacts, educational impacts, family impacts. We're very excited to be on the forefront of this.
You may have some of your legislative colleagues from across the country beating a path to your door this next few days to say, hey, I heard you did something.
Yeah.
How did the process work? You go to these sessions and you talk to people and you meet new colleagues and form relationships. But how does that translate into actual work product, you might say, for your state of Vermont? Can you draw a line between sessions here and proposed legislation, or is that an oversimplification? Is it more just a broadening of understanding and a honing of knowledge about issues?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. We get ideas from each other. We understand what other states are doing. We make contacts with people who we know that we could call on. Just being in the exhibit hall just now, I ran into a couple people who I will hope to have in next session to testify on legislation that we're doing on specific things that sound really mundane, but one thing we've been working on is emergency dispatch operations, and I just talked to somebody who's a national expert on emergency dispatch. So sometimes it's that kind of connection, other times it's getting ideas, hearing what other states are doing. We all sort of work in our own bubble back in our states, so it's great to be able to come to a place like this and really understand what's happening outside of our state, outside of our region, and get ideas and make friends and colleagues in other places.
And you're being modest. Emergency dispatch, it may not be mundane when you need an emergency responder.
It is absolutely crucial.
You seem to pick issues that may be sleeper issues, but have all burst into the headlines. Maybe we, in terms of importance and national prominence.
Yeah, I like to take on the tough things.
Before they're even considered tough. Last question, I know you're busy. What do you want your constituents or your fellow citizens of your state and of this country to know about what you do day in and day out, you and your colleagues? We all took civics lessons years ago, and we think we know what happens in the State House, but what do you want people to know about what you do and your mission?
Thank you for asking me that. I want my constituents and sort of everybody in Vermont to understand just how hard our legislature works on their behalf. We are a part-time legislature, but as we said earlier, it is certainly a full-time job. And just as an example, during this flood recovery, I've been working 24/7 to make sure my constituents have the information and the resources they need. And we, I think, also do a really thoughtful job. We try to look at the data, we try to look at the outcomes and make public policy that will work for people in Vermont. And we get ideas from other people outside of Vermont to make sure that we're really on the cutting edge of really important issues. So,
well said. Well said. A lot of people here with a lot of commitment to serving their constituents in their states. That's obvious. Ruth Hardy, Senator, Democrat from Vermont, from Middlebury. I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk not only about these few days with the Legislative Summit, but also your priorities and your hopes for your state and some of the challenges you've faced. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Well, thank you. It's been really great to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
You bet.